Hi there, Chris. Do you think the EU will go ahead with imposing this oil embargo against Iran in full at the end of the day, despite these threats that we're still hearing from Tehran that they will block the vital Strait of Hormuz in response?
Well, I think the crisis regarding Iran is ratcheting up. We've seen today William Hague say that military action has not been ruled out, and we know that Britain has got plans to join any American attack on Iran. And an oil embargo will be a very serious ratcheting up of the sanctions, which now include financial sanctions. But of course, we've also seen the killing last week of the fourth Iranian nuclear scientist, an assassination carried out in Tehran. There is a dirty covert war being waged inside Iran against the Iranian nuclear program. Not just the killing of the nuclear scientists, but attacks, bombing attacks on bases, killing of military personnel. The Israelis have been prepared to take the credit for these attacks, and I'm sure that Mossad is involved in them. In my mind, there is no question that the Americans must be involved in that. They have committed millions of dollars to destabilising the Iranian regime. They're arming ethnic groups along the borders of Iran to carry out attacks on the country. We know both Israel and America are recruiting agents in Kurdish Iraq. And I'm sure that Britain is trailing along behind that, given that's Britain's historical role. I also have to say that William Hague talk of sanctions and military action today. Britain just this week has been selling more arms, as has America, to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has 4 times the size military budget that Iran has. Saudi Arabia is urging both Israel and America to attack Iran. It's an unholy alliance of Saudi and Israel which are prompting this forward. And as a previous correspondent pointed out, it's rich, actually, that the Americans are following behind Saudi, an autocratic state which is responsible for the occupation of Bahrain and the suppression of the democracy movement there.
All right, Chris, the politics aside, what would the financial, economic implications be if this did go the full round, the EU did impose that embargo and the strait was closed by Iran?
Well, firstly, the markets are very nervous over what the price of oil would happen to the price of oil, and particularly to Brent. Very, very nervous indeed. I think the sanctions themselves are unlikely to affect Iran because Iran has had time to get alternatives in place. And it's also in a situation where it's unlikely both Russia and China will go along with these sanctions. So I think it will get round the sanctions one way or another. But sanctions have become, as we know from Yugoslavia and from Iraq, a way of softening up a country in preparation for a military assault by the West. And it's that which I am worried about. Logic says that America should not be involved in 2 full-frontal wars. That's what Obama himself says. Yet it is involved in a covert war in Iran. It is involved in Syria, and the Syrian conflict is becoming enmeshed as this because America sees overthrowing the Assad regime as removing one of Iran's key allies. Once you become involved in this sort of covert war, then as we know from history and America's own history, it's very easy to slide into an open war.
So where do you
the sorts of assassination operations...
We're running a bit short of time. Where do you think this is heading? If the international community does want to make sure Iran doesn't ever develop a nuclear weapon, what other options are there besides these tough sanctions we're already seeing and/or an all-out military assault? I mean, is there anything else that could be done?
Well, I think obviously the Israelis are talking about an attack on the nuclear program. They would like to take it out. I don't think they have the capacity to carry out more than a one-off attack. It would be up to the Americans to carry out that attack. Any attack would lead to conventional warfare in a region which is already the world's trouble spot, and it would go over into other countries, into Iraq and Lebanon. I actually believe now that such an attack is likely because I think the logic which is applied here is moving in that direction. And any mistake, for instance, if CIA operatives or Israeli operatives are captured in Tehran, and there must be spy organisations working there to carry out these assassinations, could easily trigger an open conflict. And sanctions are just a continuing racking up of this process. So therefore, in the last 6 months, I think there is a logic moving towards a military conflict, which must frighten people across the globe. It certainly frightens me.
What about the argument, I'm sure I know what you're going to say about this, what about the argument that if Iran did have a nuclear deterrent, that would arguably make the region more stable and balanced, given that Israel is currently the only, allegedly, but we think it is, nuclear power there, albeit this undeclared one?
Well, of course, Israel does not sign up to treaties which Iran has signed. Israel does not allow atomic energy inspectors in to look at its missiles, which Iran does do. There is double standards here, and Britain or France, of course, provided the means for Israel to get its secret nuclear program in place. And I think we should remember that, you know, the countries criticising Iran, America, Britain, France and Israel, have got nuclear weapons. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. Iran has not carried out any act of aggression against the United States. The United States has carried out an act of aggression against Iran. The overthrow in 1953 of the Mossadegh government, but also in the late 1980s, the shooting down a civilian airliner in which 290 passengers were killed by American forces. There is a history of American intervention against Iran. There's no history of Iranian intervention against America, Iranian military action. So we've got double bookkeeping here, as usual with the United States and Britain, and the charge of hypocrisy once more leaps to mind.
From London, Chris Bambury, political analyst, thank you very much for your thoughts.